Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So I'm here with my colleagues, and I'll let Matt introduce himself if you would like to.
Hey everybody, I'm Matt. I'm a senior data analyst with IPUMS PMA.
My name is Devin Christensen. I'm the project manager for IPUMS PMA. So today I'll be describing the new family planning longitudinal panel data for performance monitoring for action that we have harmonized at IPUMS. So I think I'm just going to give another minute or two because I see that people are still coming in. And I'll mention this a couple times in the webinar, but we are recording and we will be posting code and the Q&A and also the recording online relatively soon after we are done today. All right, well, I think I'm going to get started. So welcome everyone. This is a general outline of how we'll proceed. First, I'll describe what IPUMS does. For those of you who might not be familiar with us at IPUMS, what IPUMS PMA currently includes. Then I'll proceed to describe the sample design of the new longitudinal panel. I'll go through a brief demonstration of how to create a custom data file on our website that contains wide form longitudinal records where the women's panel records are already linked for you. Lastly, we'll go through more technical aspects of the data format, and I'll show a very simple analysis of the new data just to get you started. So a few logistics. This webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the ipums.org website, and we'll share that, that link to where it will be posted at the end of the webinar. It will also be posted along with the data code that I'm going to be using today and a written form of the Q&A. If you would like to take advantage of real-time closed captions that are being generated, you can click on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions regarding Zoom, please use the chat function and send that message directly to the IPUMS host. And if you have questions about the content of the webinar, questions about the data or things that I've covered, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and then we'll have a couple times that we'll pause and go through questions. All right, so first, in case there are members of the audience who are not familiar with IPUMS, I want to briefly explain what we do. So we are based at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. And we take public use data such as census and survey data from around the world, and we integrate it across time and place. We also systematically document the data to make it easier for researchers to study change, conduct comparative research, merge information across data types, and analyze individuals within family and community context. We are grant funded by multiple entities, including the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation, and in PMA's case, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So access to the data is always free from us. One thing I would like to emphasize is that we do not collect data ourselves. We access existing data and make it easier to use. We offer a variety of integrated microdata collections from US and international census data, surveys on the labor force, time use, and health. We also have a couple aggregate data collections, population and agricultural censuses. The data collection that I manage and the one that we're talking about today is IPUMS PMA, which is the harmonized version of performance monitoring for action, which is a high frequency recent survey on family planning, reproductive and sexual health that began in 2013. It collects data from participating high fertility countries generally annually, and there are currently 9 participating countries. It was originally designed to monitor progress towards FP 2020 goals that were established at the 2012 London Summit on Family Planning. The data is collected by a collaboration of in-country partners and a team at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. And both PMA and IPUMS PMA are funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So this is a general map to show the coverage of countries within PMA. So we have Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, India, Kenya, Niger, Nigeria, and Uganda that are currently participating. And then Ghana and Indonesia were at one point participants. Ethiopia does not have the longitudinal family planning data that we're going to be talking about today, but the other 8 are. They are participating in the panel design. So when PMA first began, its core sample design was very similar to the demographic and health surveys. So it was a multi-stage stratified cluster sampling, random small primary sampling units that PMA refers to as enumeration areas or EAs were randomly selected, and they had around 200 households. And then households within those selected areas were randomly selected, and it was around 35 households per EA. They were given a household survey to get a roster of everyone in the household. And then there was a follow-up survey for all women between the ages of 15 to 49. So in addition to these household and female surveys, PMA also collects surveys of service delivery points, such as like hospitals, pharmacies, and these facilities are within the same small areas as the sampled households at around the same time. So those data can be linked together. There are also 2 maternal and newborn health panel surveys conducted in Ethiopia that are, one of them is currently available in IPUMS PMA. And there's also client exit interviews and 2 rounds of nutrition survey data conducted in Burkina Faso and Kenya. One thing I also, so what we do with the data is that we take it from its original form, its public use form from the PMA website. We harmonize the codes and variable names across countries and across time, because there's new categories get added, or different countries may name their variables differently. So we make sure that samples can be pooled and codes will always retain the same meaning over time. A lot of our work also involves systematically documenting variables, so you understand comparability issues over time, if there's changes in the question wording, or if the logical skip pattern changed, and that means that the universe of the question is different. We document that at the sample level and at the variable level. What we also do is that our website allows us to disseminate custom data files in multiple formats. So it can be read into Stata, SPSS, SAS, and R. We also add some calculated fields. For example, we create a denormalized population weighted weight. And then our site also links longitudinal records together for you. Another feature that I want to mention is our joint project, the IPUMS PMA Data Analysis Hub. So my colleague Matt publishes this blog along with some postdocs of ours, and there are new posts about twice a month. The blog is an excellent resource for understanding how to use IPUMS PMA data. It's primarily in R, but they show how to do sample analyses, ask some pretty innovative questions. They highlight publications using PMA data, and they show the R code to show how the analysis was done. There's also some amazing data visualizations, and it shows you exactly how those analyses and visualizations were accomplished. So the blog is currently working on a 6-part series about the longitudinal data. So be sure to visit it and stay tuned for the next couple of posts. Okay, so now we finally get to the focus of the webinar, which is the new panel design. So starting in 2019, PMA rolled out a new open longitudinal panel design of women of childbearing age in 8 countries. And it's 3 survey phases that are each a year apart. The goal of the longitudinal design is to better understand contraceptive and fertility dynamics over time. In addition to the 3 surveys, PMA also collects several years of overlapping contraceptive calendar data, much like the DHS contraceptive calendar. And in later phases, additional households were sampled to make sure that there would be a cross-sectional subsample in case of areas of high attrition. So what I mean by an open panel is that women in sampled households who age in, so if they were age 14 in the first phase, but they turn 15 between the phases, they are then surveyed once they become of age. And then when they age out of the sample, they're no longer interviewed with that female survey. The same applies if a woman leaves a household that's sampled or moves into a sampled household. So a woman could also enter the panel if their household was selected to be part of the cross-sectional sample due to a high attrition in their geographic area. And a high level of attrition would be 10% of sampled households in that area. So this is a figure that shows the data collection that has already occurred. I mean, there are some phase 3 surveys that have just recently been conducted, but not enough space on this page for that quite yet. But they're also not on this diagram because they're not yet publicly available. And the range depicted on the screen shows what's currently available in IPUMS with the exclusion of Niger phase 1 that's only just recently been released publicly by PMA, and we haven't had time to process that yet. But we do hope to release it and the remaining phase 2 countries by the end of this year. So we currently have Burkina Faso, DRC, Kenya, and Nigeria, phase 1 and phase 2. So it's important to understand which sample that you're working with to make sure you're using the correct weight for your analyses. So for the cross-sectional files and variables from the female survey for one sample, you should be using the variable FQ weight, and that is a normalized weight. If you're using a variable from the household questionnaire, you should restrict to one member of the household and use HQ weight to say that like this proportion of households have this characteristic. Those are both normalized weights, so they will estimate a nationally or regionally representative proportion for a particular indicator. If you're pooling multiple countries, we recommend that you use a denormalized population weighted weight created by IPUMS. We call this hot weight. However, if you are using longitudinal data, so using the full file, and you are looking at women who are interviewed in both and in multiple phases, panel weight controls for attrition and loss to follow-up. And so that's what we recommend for longitudinal analyses. So that brings me to loss to follow-up. So naturally, when conducting a panel survey, there will inevitably be some loss to follow-up between phases. For the PMA survey, the types of loss to follow-up include at the dwelling level. So the interviewer might arrive at a sample dwelling and find it to be destroyed or replaced by a commercial structure. There could be loss at the household level. It could be that the entire household moved out of a study area. There could be a loss at the household roster. So it could be that the woman herself moved out of the study area or she may have died. And lastly, there could be at the female level, if the woman still lived in her sampled household that she was in the previous phase, it could be that she refused to continue participating in the panel, or maybe she was away for an extended period of time and was not available for the interview. So that's another source of loss to follow-up. So what does that mean for you as a data user? Depending on the type of missing data, the results might look a little different when you download a data file from our website. For example, if a panel member is a woman who was interviewed in phase 1 and was still eligible to be interviewed at phase 2. So if she was found but not interviewed in phase 2, it's like perhaps it's known what happened to her, like a neighbor said, oh, she moved away. There is a record in the phase 2 file, and we're able to link her record by her identifier. So in this case, what you'd see in the IPUMS data is that she would have an NIU code, so she's no longer in universe. If she was not able to be found or there wasn't enough information about why she was lost to follow-up, there's no record for her in phase 2. Instead, her record in the link file will be empty. Or depending on your statistical software, like in Stata, it might be a dot for like missing or blank. In R, it might be NA. Another example of missing data, if you have a new panel member, so let's say it's a woman who moved in or aged in, her data for phase 1 would be missing blank or NA. Lastly, household members are not able to be linked across phases. Only women panel members have identifiers that can be linked. So the household members will have blank or missing variables. Like their cases will be blank depending on which time period they were not observed in. And then also some variables were not asked in both phases. For example, the 4 phase 1 data samples that we're going to be looking at today, their first baseline survey happened before COVID-19. So they could not possibly have asked a question in phase 1 about how concerned the woman was about contracting COVID. But in phase 2, they had enough time to change the survey a little bit and ask the women how COVID had affected them. So obviously in the variable for that, that variable about concern about COVID is going to be blank in phase 1 versions. Okay, so before we go to the website to create a file, I did want to describe it a little bit more detail about the difference between downloading a cross-sectional file and a longitudinal file on our website. So the variable that indicates whether the person was included in a cross-sectional file is called cross-section. This will highlight, this is a screenshot from our website. This is how our display is like, this is how we display our variable documentation with different tabs. And to go into a little bit more detail. So when we download the data directly from PMA, we have all the records from all people. And so let's say this is a really small grouping of those data. So the first 3 columns are going to be the household identifiers. We have, let's say, 3 households that we're looking at right here. We have 1 and 2 and 3. The next 2 columns are the age of the person record that we're looking at. And then this last column here will be the cross-section variable. And you'll see that households 1 and 3 are included in the cross-section, but household 2 is marked as not part of the cross-section. And so when you're downloading a cross-sectional file, what you're doing is we've dropped out the people who are not included in it so that you don't have to take that step when you download it from the website if you're only interested in calculating indicators over time. That's what you get when you download a cross-sectional file. But if you're downloading a longitudinal file, you get all types of households. Okay, so at this point, we're getting very close to going to the website, but I do want to give you just a little bit more about what you will be downloading. So you will have the opportunity to download a long form longitudinal file. So right here, the FQ inst ID is the female identifier that is used to link female records. If you download a long form version of the longitudinal file, you'll have a record for every time that the woman was interviewed or observed. So you see that the FQ inst ID is repeated because we have a baseline survey and a follow-up survey. And you see that this woman here at the top I've highlighted, she's aged from 28 to 29. And then you download a wide form, and it's not shown, but what you would see with that female identifier, FQ inst ID, that is not going to be repeated. It will be unique because every woman's record is only on one row and is not repeated. Instead, we have variables with different suffixes to indicate the phase. For example, this woman here, in phase 1, she was married, so marital status 1. And then, she was not married in the first phase, but then in phase 2, she was married. So that is what the data looks like when you download it from our website, open it in Stata, the difference between long form and wide form. Okay, so at this point, I know that was a lot of information very fast. So we're going to take a pause and see if there are any questions in the Q&A before we keep going. So Matt or Kari, are there some questions that have come up in the Q&A?
We don't have any questions yet, Devin. Could you maybe just recap for us, like why you would want to select a cross-sectional data extract instead of a longitudinal one? Like what's the purpose of having both available on the website?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a great question. So the reason that you would want to choose the cross-sectional version is that you can pool it with all the previous years of IPUMS PMA. And if you were more interested in calculating a continuous, getting a continuous calculation of an indicator over time, and so they've made sure that there's a cross-sectional version to make sure that you have a comparable continuation through time. For example, if you were simply looking to show the modern contraceptive prevalence rate in Kenya from 2014 all the way through 2020. But with the longitudinal version, it doesn't go back as far. We only have this one cohort, but it's that if you download the longitudinal version, you'll be able to conduct analysis like we'll be doing later on in the webinar. Do you think that covers it, Matt? Or we can also revisit that when we get to the website.
Sounds great to me. Thanks, Devin.
Okay. Thanks, Matt. Okay, great. Well, with that, it'll bring us to the website. All right. So as you notice, I'm already logged in here, but in order to be able to download the data, and like I said earlier, IPUMS data is always free to access, but you will need to register an account. So if you don't already have an IPUMS PMA account, you'll want to go to this register button, and when you submit your registration to get access to the data, you'll have to give us a bit of a description about how you plan to use the data. Because I read through every single application and I make sure that the data is being appropriately used. And basically what we mean by that is it has to be a non-commercial purpose, usually for education or to publish in an article, or like journalists also use IPUMS data. But if you're looking to use the data commercially or if you say you only want to study Kenya, but you request all the data, we have based on the agreements with the country partners have with PMA, you have to approve uses very specifically. So make sure to register an account first in order to get access to the data. And then when you come to our home page, you go to select data. You'll notice that we went straight in, but the first time that you come to the IPUMS site, you'll actually be greeted with this menu here. My browser remembers me and it knows the last time I came into here, I chose the person family planning. But this is the first menu you'll see, so you can choose the topic that you're interested in. I described a little earlier, PMA includes a lot of different surveys, but the core one that we're looking at and where you will find the cross-sectional longitudinal data is under the family planning person. Okay, so what I will be doing for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to go to selecting samples first because I know what I want is the longitudinal data. But getting to the question that Matt asked just a bit ago, this is where you can access the cross-sectional. That'll be the default, and you'll see that you'll have access to all of the samples that have ever been collected by PMA back to the very beginning, and you can pool them all years or countries into one data file. So if you compared if you went to the original website, you'd have to download each of these samples individually and append them together, but only after making a few changes to make sure that variables are harmonized. But here, it's just takes a click. So you can select all samples with one click. However, for this webinar, we're going to the longitudinal area. And as you can see, you have the option of choosing long or wide. And just for a refresher, you can hover over this icon to remind yourself, okay, the long version means that there's a row for every time a person is surveyed. So that could be multiple rows per person. But today we're going to be working with a wide form data file. So that means each row represents an individual with variables replicated for every survey round. We also have this great link here that goes to a more in-depth discussion of the difference between long and wide format. And that's just a really good refresher. So for this workshop, I'm going to be selecting the Burkina Faso, and I want the Kinshasa only. For Congo, I'm going to take the Kenya sample and also Lagos. So you'll see here that we have the opportunity to choose who is in our data file. The default is female respondents only. I'm going to stick with that, but you have the option of including additional people. For example, so PMA includes records for even people who were not interviewed, so you can calculate response rates, and there's like a video tutorial that you can reference for more information about that. That's on our website, and I'll share the link to how to get to those video tutorials later. But for now, these are exactly the samples that I want. I'm going to submit sample selections. Okay. So next, we're going to browse to choose our variables. So the very first, I'm going to choose a technical variable called the result FQ. And this is just because I want to show you a little bit more about we were talking about types of missing data, and I think this variable is helpful to show, to illustrate what I mean by that, and like the records that are included in the data file. So we're going to include that variable. And next, going to go to the weights and estimation group. And then we talked about weights. So I'm going to make sure I select the panel weight and make sure we include that in our data file. So I want to make sure I have a representative and weighted estimate. Next, I want to grab some core demographic variables. So for the sake of this data file, we're going to be using the variable pregnant. But usually when I'm creating a data file, I also like to throw in things like age, education, marital status. You don't actually need those for the code that we're going to use in this webinar, but I always like to throw them in just in case. Next, I want to add in from the current or recent family planning use. I want to look at whether this woman is a current contraceptive user. I'm also going to add in what her method is that she's using right now, because I want to look at whether women are using the same method or switching methods between the two time periods. Then lastly, because the PMA is used to calculate the de facto population, we're also going to add a variable about what type of resident this woman is. I'll just show you like a little bit of how you might use our documentation. So we would be in our analysis, we're going to be including women who were visitors, but they slept in the household last night. We will not be including women who are usual members, but did not sleep in the household the previous night. But we will also be including usual members and women who slept in the household the previous night. So good to keep an eye on what those codes are. And the X's are for whether those categories are included in the samples. Okay. All right, I'm just looking at my list of variables here. I think I've got all the ones I wanted. Excellent. And if for more detail on our website and like how to use all of our documentation, we also have video tutorials on what each of those tabs were that you were seeing. For example, you can look at the questionnaire text associated with that variable, look at the comparability, but I want to make sure that this is a pretty lean webinar, and I'm just going to focus on the longitudinal data for now. But we have lots of resources to help you figure out how to use our website. And we can, of course, go over questions like that at the end if you have them. Okay, so I've going through the steps of submitting my data cart. One great thing about IPUMS is that you can choose your data format. So if you are an R user, you would want to keep your data format as the .dat, and you'd get a fixed width version, but I'm a Stata user. I will be using Stata for this webinar. So I'm going to go ahead and change it into a Stata format. Excellent. And then I'm going to describe my extract. So I know later on what I included in here. Let's say wide form. Okay. And at the risk of repeating myself or becoming a broken record, there are also video tutorials on how to open data extracts in different statistical packages. So there's one for how to open Stata, SPSS, SAS, and R. And as you can see, here are my previous data files, and I was doing lots of tests in preparation for this webinar. So we're just going to wait until this is done processing. And And what will happen is as soon as your data file is done, you'll get an email. I'm just going to refresh because I know it's a pretty small file and I know that it won't take very long. So what I did here is I right-clicked on Downloads Data. I'm going to save the link into this folder I have. And now I'm going to go to that folder location where I saved my data. So that's extract 240. And you'll notice that it has a .gz file extension on it. That means that you've downloaded a compressed file. So I'm going to go, I use a free decompression software called 7-Zip, but I know there's a couple out there. So now I've extracted or decompressed my data file. And I could just, open this up directly, but I have a do file here. So I am going to go straight to my do file. So this is the folder where I saved my data. All right, so before I start with the Stata code, are there any questions in the Q&A?
No questions yet, Devin, but I would also mention to people who maybe are users, since I spend a lot of time importing IPUMS data into R, that there's an R package published by IPUMS called IPUMS R, and I'll drop a link to that in the chat.
Excellent, thanks, Matt. And the blog is also a great place to get support understanding how to use IPUMS PMA data in R. Okay, great. I'm actually going to change the type of share that I'm doing just because I'm going to be switching back and forth between my Stata do file and the Stata window itself. Actually, quick question, Matt, is the font size large enough on the screen? I increased it a little bit.
It is, Devin.
It's good. Okay. Okay.
Thank
Just
you.
checking. All right. Excellent. Thanks, Gary. All righty. All right. So I'm going to first read in my data file and then bring up. Okay. Great. So the first thing that I wanted to show you was the cross tabulation of this result variable. So I wanted to bring to your attention how, so we selected as our sample members only female respondents. And so what that will do for the data file I've downloaded is that for the phase 1 result, we're only keeping women who completed or partially completed their interview. You could, of course, include, you could change the sample members if you wanted to see women who refused in the first round, but they're not followed up with. But I've kept just the women who consented to be interviewed. And you can see that there were more than 5,000 women who completed a phase 2 survey that were not interviewed in phase 1. And that was one of the types of missing data that I brought up earlier. That is women who moved in, aged in, or they were sampled for, like, their household was sampled for the first time in phase 2 due to attrition. Let's see here. There was something else I wanted to point out. And then the women who were interviewed and had a completed interview in phase 1, but they were not at home or was postponed or they were gone for some reason. So the NIUs, that will be women who like they moved away. There's just some reason that like they're no longer eligible to be part of phase 2, then they get the NIU. However, there's 2,600 women who just could not be found, and they did not have a record at all in phase 2, so they have a missing. So I did just want to like let you know that there's a lot of cases in here that are not fully complete. So the first step that I'm going to take to like kind of clean up this data file is we're going to keep only women who completed their phase 2 and phase 1 interviews. So I'm going to keep only if they were completed. And I'm also not going to consider women who had partially completed interviews. So we've dropped both of those types of women out. If they are women who did not have complete interviews. Okay. And then because in the PMA panel reports, only the de facto population is used in the analytical sample. And so in case you just wanted to see what that looked like, we're going to look at whether the woman was a resident in phase 1. So here we are, a visitor slept in the household last night. We do want to keep those women. Or if we had a usual member but did not sleep in the household last night, they are not part of the de facto population, so we're not going to include them. And I just wanted to show you, like, if you wanted to know, like, how do we keep them out? What I tend to do is just drop the label so I know what the code is. And so we're going to keep only if they were a part of the de facto population in both phase 1 and phase 2. And that's what this line is. I'm going to run that code. Okay, so we've dropped out 432 cases. Now we have our analytical sample. So I'm just going to take a sip of water here. Okay, now we can finally get to answering a few questions with the data. So because this is a survey on family planning and like fertility dynamics, so let's take a look at comparing women's use of a contraceptive method in both phase 1 and phase 2. And you'll notice that I'm excluding cases where, so CP is contraceptive user. You'll see that I'm excluding cases that are greater than 90, and that's just because I know that there have been like 4 or 5 cases here that like they just have missing data. So we've given them a 99. Okay, so, and I gave it a comma row because I want to look at for women who were using or not using family planning in phase 1, what's the proportion that they're still using or not using in phase 2? So as you'll see, and this is not weighted, and this is across 4 geographic areas. So among women who were not using a family planning method in phase 1, 27% of the women in the sample were using a method when they were interviewed in phase 2 around a year later. And then if among women who were using a method at phase 1, more than 23% of these sampled women were not using by phase 2. So one of the, so if we had only had cross-sectional data, what we would be seeing is that there's a modest increase in the number of contraceptive users, but that doesn't really show us, like we wouldn't have seen that there's actually a large number of women who changed their reproductive behaviors over a relatively short amount of time. We wouldn't have seen that 27% of women are going of women who are not using took up family planning, but 23% of women who are using were discontinuing. So there's just a lot that we can learn from these data about knowing who's moving in and out and why that might be, what characteristics a woman might have that differentiates her from a woman who discontinued or a woman who took up. There's a lot of questions that can be answered. So for our next step, I'm going to create a variable that captures women who were not using family planning in phase 1, and then has an indicator whether or not they were using family planning in phase 2, because I want to demonstrate how we use the panel weight. So I'm going to create a variable called FP start, and I'm going to initialize it as being missing. And then my next step, I'm going to replace it with a 0 if the woman was not using family planning in phase 1. But then I'm going to replace it once again with a 1 if she was not using in phase 1, but was using in phase 2. So that way we keep women who were using in phase 1 as missing, because for the purpose of this particular variable, I'm not very interested in women who are already using. I only want to look at women who were not using to begin. So I'm going to run that code. And then we can take a look at how these different geographic areas differ from each other. So if you recall, we are using the Burkina Faso sample, and that's going to be women from, that's going to be a nationally representative group of women from Burkina Faso when we use the weight, of course. For the DRC, we only chose the Kinshasa sample. For Kenya, this is also nationally representative, but for Nigeria, we chose the city of Lagos. So there's some difference in the proportion of women who took up family planning. So Kenya had the highest proportion of women, of surveyed women, this is not weighted, compared to the other geographies we're looking at. Okay, so next we're going to introduce the panel weight to this analysis. So what I prefer to do in Stata is that I'm going to declare panel weight to be our survey weight, and then I'm going to tell Stata that our primary sampling unit is this variable called EAID, and we have a version in phase 1 and phase 2. For all intents and purposes, the woman should be staying in the same area, because if she moved out of an EA or a sampled area, we wouldn't be able to follow her. There was one case of a woman who moved from one sampled EA to another sampled EA, and she was followed. But I'm just going to choose EAID2 because we have to use one of them. So I'm going to declare that to be our survey setup. And then we can run that same command, but this time it will be weighted to control for attrition and like making sure that this is representative of its area. So not a lot changed, though the proportion of women taking up. So looks like the sample for Burkina was more likely than like the national average to take up family planning. So that's interesting, but that's how you would apply the panel weight to make sure that you have representative estimates. Okay. So one other step that I wanted to throw in here is perhaps you were interested in finding the weighted proportion of women who were pregnant in phase 1 and to see whether or not they were using a family planning method in phase 2. So I'm going to do the same thing, and I want to split it up by our geographies that we downloaded. But I'm going to restrict it now for if she was pregnant in phase 1, so pregnant equals 1. Did she start? Was she using a family planning method in phase 2? Okay. And as you see, now we're starting to get much higher percentages of women who started family planning if they had been pregnant in phase 1. And this has like a gut check, like this makes sense to me because of women who were not pregnant in phase 1, there's probably a large number of women who are not using family planning because they are not sexually active. But if they're pregnant in phase 1, they're clearly sexually active. So these women are more likely to take up family planning by phase 2. Let's see here. Okay, I think we have one more thing I wanted to show. One thing that is of a lot of interest, especially to the group at Johns Hopkins, who, in addition to doing this great work of designing the surveys and help collect the data, they also produce a lot of briefs and publications on the data showing what we can learn from it. And one thing that they do is they also focus on method switching, which is it's also another reason why the longitudinal data can be very powerful, because if you have cross-sectional data, we just see that women are using a method, but this way we can see, okay, if the woman is using a family planning method in both phase 1 and phase 2, is she still using the same method? And I think that could be really enlightening to see, well, maybe she discontinued there was something about the first method she was using that was just not to her liking. She wanted to try a different one. So I'm going to create a variable called same method. I'm going to construct this very similarly to when we created FP start. So we're going to say that she's using the same method if she's using family planning in both phase 1 and phase 2. But we only give her a 1 if the method she was using, FP CURR for current, EFF for most effective method, and then METH for the method she's using. So she only gets a 1 if she's using the exact same method between the two, or she gets a 0 if she's using in both of them, but she's switched her method. And then women who were either not using family planning at all or started or stopped between these two phases, they will have a missing for same method. So let's go ahead and run that. Now we can take a look at what this looks like across our 4 geographies. Oh, already defined. I see. My mistake. Okay. Must have run that multiple times. Okay. I'll switch back over here. Okay, great. So it looks like in Burkina, about 80% of the women who are using a method in both phases were still using the same method. But what I find to be very interesting is that the cities, so Kinshasa and in Lagos, it's a much lower percentage. So this could be, this is just my speculation. These are women in urban areas. Perhaps they have more exposure and more access to different options. So it might be easier for them to access a method, but that's something to look into further. So maybe we would see the same thing if we restricted Burkina and Kenya just down to Nairobi and Ouagadougou. To me, I find that very interesting. Other ideas you might want to consider to like try to get the ideas flowing. Perhaps you can look into which method were women most likely to discontinue using. You can look at other variables like fertility intentions. So how did a woman's fertility intentions change before and after COVID-19? And there's in fact a paper out there by the PMA team on just that question. So there's just so many opportunities to look at these data in so many different ways. And it'll only get more powerful when hopefully sometime next year we'll have phase 3 data available on IPUMS PMA. And with that, I'm going to return to the presentation because I did want to bring to everyone's attention that we are partnering with the Johns Hopkins team and putting on a webinar similar to this, but it's going to be a little less technical on the this is what the missing data looks like side, but we're going to be more in depth on analyzing, did the COVID-19 pandemic impact contraceptive use? So keep an eye out for the registration link on Twitter through the IPUMS Twitter. You can also watch the Johns Hopkins PMA team PM for Action on Twitter. And that will be on May 18th at 9 Eastern or 8 Central. Let's see here. And as promised, here are some links to other resources for you. We have a dedicated user support email, that's ipums@umn.edu. They know so much about all the IPUMS projects, but if there just happens to be something that they don't know, which is pretty rare, they can find the right person to answer that question. And then the first link here, that is links to PMA video tutorials and other types of resources for you about PMA specifically. And another thing I want to draw your attention to is that we have a very extensive documentation on the longitudinal files, and that's the z.umn.edu/PMA_long. So lots of information on the missing variables, the panel membership, cross-sectional or not cross-sectional. But thank you so much for your attention, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're really excited to share these data because we just think that they are one of a kind. And you can, and to just reemphasize, you can also link facility data to this. So you can also look at the family planning service environment and how, because they follow this, you can link facilities over time as well to see if there's changes in supply. There's just so many opportunities for original research with these data. So thanks again.